Hi, and welcome to the Planning Board webinar, an introduction to the basics. If you're a Planning Board member, thank you for volunteering your time for the important work you do in our community. This webinar is based on the Montana Planning Board Members Handbook, updated in 2020. It is intended for new Planning Board members as well as those who may have more experience. The handbook has more information and is available from the Montana Department of Commerce Community Technical Assistance Program. In this webinar, we will cover the purpose of a planning board basics and the growth policy, planning board's role in subdivision review, conducting meetings and hearings, and the planning board organization. What is a planning board? A planning board is a group of citizens who advise on planning, land use, and community development for towns, cities, and counties. The governing bodies of the local jurisdiction appoint them. The governing body of a county is the Board of County Commissioners, and the governing body of a city or town is the City Council or City Commission. What do planning boards do? Planning boards advise the governing bodies on land use matters. The two lists on the bottom right show those functions authorized or required in Montana state statute. Planning boards have a role in growth policies, subdivision, county-initiated zoning, urban renewal plans, conservation easements, and lakeshore regulations. In addition, they can propose subdivision regulations and regulations and plans for infrastructure. They can also advise on other plans. Although there are several land use matters that involve a planning board, some of the requirements apply only in counties and some apply only in cities. In most Montana communities, planning boards spend more time on subdivision review than any other function. Developing and implementing growth policies is typically next in terms of work effort. In Montana, each planning board has a legally defined area for which it is responsible, the planning board's jurisdictional area. The jurisdictional area can be a city, a county, or a combination of cities or cities and counties. The number of planning board members and what jurisdictions they represent varies by what is included in the planning board's jurisdictional area. State statute instructs planning boards to develop regulations for planning board affairs. Planning boards adopt and operate under bylaws to fulfill this statutory duty. The planning board can make recommendations on land use matters, but the governing body makes the final decision. The governing body also appoints staff to assist with planning board activities. Staff typically administer local regulations and prepare detailed written reports for planning board review on proposed subdivisions, growth policies, and other land use matters. These fundamentals can guide how you act in any task you take on as a board member. Number 1, act in the public interest. Planning board members must act and make decisions in the public interest. The public interest represents the benefits to society rather than to a certain group or an individual. For the planning board, the society is the community that you serve in your jurisdictional area. Number 2, provide objective decisions. Objective, reasonable decision-making based on facts is fundamental to sound and legal defensible decisions. Every decision on land use applications reviewed by the planning board should have a written record called findings of fact. Number 3, understand plans and regulations. Read and be familiar with the local growth policy, subdivision regulations, and any other regulations and plans the planning board deals with on a regular basis. Doing so will help ensure objective decision-making. Number 4, work to update local regulations to conform to state statute. Much of what you review as a planning board member is explicitly required by Montana statute. Montana land use statutes have been changed in nearly every legislative session for the past 20 years. If local regulations, including subdivision regulations, are not updated to conform to state statute, it can result in confusion and potential legal issues. Number 5, involve the public and build awareness. Encouraging public involvement, communicating the value of planning, and consensus building are important for planning board members. Planning board members learn what is important to everyone in the community by listening to citizens' concerns, especially those concerns of differing views. Why should a community plan? Planning drives constructive change in a long-range context. Communities that don't plan get left behind. Planning builds momentum for priority projects. Planning ensures initiatives are not redundant or going in different directions. Planning is more cost-effective than reacting to problems. Planning provides predictability. Planning makes it easier for private sectors to assess costs and benefits of development. Planning provides continuity through political cycles. Planning improves the ability to compete for economic activity, and planning helps conserve areas important for public and environment. In addition, planning makes it easier to secure project funding. Government agencies and private-public partners want to see how a proposed project fits within a big picture for long-range planning. Some will not fund without that information. In Montana, a growth policy is the plan that describes the community's long-term vision and the general steps needed to achieve the vision. The term growth policy is equally applicable to Montana communities that are experiencing dramatic population increases and those that have a static or declining population. All communities can benefit from establishing a vision for their future. Montana statute requires planning boards to develop growth policies, hold public hearings, and make a recommendation to the governing body. It does not require planning boards to actually write the plan. Staff who are familiar with the statutory requirements typically write the document with guidance from the planning board. Montana statute requires the following contents in a growth policy: existing and future trends for several topics, including land uses, population, housing, economics, local services, and natural resources. Goals and objectives. Implementation, including strategies and a schedule. Subdivision review criteria. Subdivision hearing process. Public infrastructure strategy. Provisions for updates, and more items that may be required under certain circumstances or that are optional add-ons. Planning board members' role on a growth policy generally include guiding development of the growth policy overall, understanding why a growth policy is important, and being able to communicate that to others. Reviewing draft documents and other growth policy materials, discussing drafts and other growth policy items with staff or consultants as part of scheduling planning board meetings. Encouraging opportunities for sharing information with the public and obtaining comments to help share the growth policy before the required public hearing, and holding a public hearing and considering comments prior to making recommendation to the governing body. The last item I mentioned is a requirement of Montana statute. Planning boards play an important role in monitoring progress on growth policy initiatives by providing annual progress reports to the governing body, being proactive about updates, and being advocates for moving action strategies forward. This can be done in two ways: by communicating with the governing body on a regular basis regarding growth policy implementation, and by working with staff to prepare recommendations to the governing body on project priorities, implementation schedule, and identifying needed resource opportunities. Planning boards review regulations, applications, and plans for conformity with the growth policy. Lists of these items are shown next to the blue and gold tabs on the slide. Of particular note, municipal zoning must follow the guidance in the growth policy. State statute requires subdivision regulations to conform to the growth policy, and the growth policy must contain the following items pertaining to subdivision review. The growth policy must define the 608 sub 3 sub A criteria, a reference to their location in state statute. These are subdivision review criteria for impacts on agriculture, agricultural water user facilities, local services, the natural environment, wildlife habitat, and public health and safety. Growth policies also establish the procedures for subdivision hearings. Subdivision, generally speaking, is a division of land into parcels intended for sale or other transfer of ownership. The plat is the document that creates the land into subdivision lots. Subdivision plats include the overall layout of streets, utilities, lots, blocks, and public areas. The schematic in the lower right-hand corner of this slide is a subdivision plat for hundreds of lots. The process of information from staff and the public to the planning board prior to their recommendation is the same general approach as for growth policies, as shown in the upper right-hand corner of this slide. There are 10 basic steps in subdivision review, and only 2 require direct participation by the planning board. The 2 planning board activities are shown in gold on the slide. The first 6 steps are generally managed by staff and include staff holding a pre-application meeting with the subdivider to review initial concepts proposed by the subdivider and to review subdivision requirements, the developer submitting the application, then staff reviewing the application for all required elements and for sufficiency of the information. Up next is the site inspection. This may include the planning board, but if it does, it would need to be noticed as a planning board meeting. After a site inspection, staff submits the application to utility providers and local, state, and federal agencies to help determine if the subdivision meets other applicable regulations. The next step in the process is the staff report. This document includes findings of fact, conclusions, and staff recommendations on approval, conditional approval, or denial. The next two steps involve the planning board. Before the planning board makes its recommendation, it considers public comment. The Montana Subdivision and Plating Act requires at least one public hearing. Many communities have a hearing with the planning board and another with the governing body. Note that the first minor subdivision from a tract of record is exempted from any hearing requirement. A minor subdivision contains 5 or fewer lots. Next is the planning board making a recommendation to the governing body to approve with conditions, or deny the application. The governing body then considers the planning board's recommendation along with public comment, subdivision application materials, and other information and makes their final decision. If the planning board has not held a public hearing, the governing body must hold one prior to its decision. If the preliminary plat application is approved or approved with conditions, the subdivider then prepares the materials for final plat. The governing body reviews those materials to ensure that conditions and final plat requirements have been met. Upon receiving final plat approval, the subdivider might file the final plat with the clerk and recorder, and the lots are officially recognized as individual parcels for transfer. Planning board recommendation is made based on review criteria, any requests for variances, and conditions for mitigating adverse impacts. The rationale for the recommendation is made in the findings of fact and conclusions. The statutory review criteria are listed in the upper left-hand corner. These include 608 sub 3 sub A criteria, the subdivision review criteria for impacts on agriculture, agricultural water user facilities, local services, the natural environment, wildlife habitat, and public health and safety, survey requirements, subdivision regulation requirements, subdivision review procedures, utility easements, and legal and physical access. If a subdivision does not meet the review criteria or impacts are significant and conditions will bring the subdivision into compliance and reduce impacts to acceptable levels, then conditions can be part of an approval with conditions. If a request for a variance has been received, the planning board recommendation must address the variances. A variance is a relaxation of a requirement when strict adherence would cause undue hardship. Economic hardship alone is insufficient to qualify as an undue hardship. Typically, the undue hardship relates to unique conditions on the site. No variance can violate other regulations, increase public costs, or adversely affect public health and safety. The importance of findings of fact cannot be underestimated. They inform the legal basis for the recommendation. Findings of fact typically present facts for each review criterion and draw conclusions based on the facts. The findings of fact and conclusions lead to the recommendation to approve, conditionally approve, or deny the subdivision. Montana's open meeting laws require all local government meetings, including planning board meetings, to be open to the public. Anytime a quorum of members is present at a location or in a car or via phone or on an online meeting could constitute a meeting subject to the open meeting requirements. There are 5 basic public participation requirements. Those include notice prior to the meeting, which includes date, time, place, and agenda, plus information on how to submit comments separate from the meeting and a deadline for all comments. The notice must occur in a reasonable period before the meeting. A general rule of thumb for minimum notice is 48 hours, but beware, there are specific and longer noticing requirements for hearings. Second, information. The public should have an opportunity to obtain information for every agenda item at the time the notice is published. Decision makers and public should be on equal footing with respect to participation in the decision. Number 3, no new items can be added to the agenda at the meeting or hearing. Carry over new items to the next regularly scheduled meeting or special meeting. Number 4, provide the opportunity for public comment on each agenda item. And finally, number 5, the public must have the opportunity to comment on items that are not on the agenda. Those who cannot attend the meeting or who need special accommodations must be given the opportunity to comment. Consider what may be needed for those with limited physical abilities, mobility, hearing, or sight. For persons who cannot attend, provide information on how to submit comments and where to access the meeting information. Issues associated with COVID-19, the pandemic that began in 2020, have highlighted the particular issue for persons who cannot attend meetings. Many communities have held in-person meetings with physical distancing, masking, rooms with good ventilation, or outdoor meetings. Others have opted for online meetings using Zoom or other software. and others have used both simultaneously. The Planning Board does not need to respond to questions or comments individually. They need to listen to comments overall and then consider them in their entirety before making a decision. Responding to each comment in a public meeting or hearing can result in a lengthier meeting and possible back and forth dialogue with a handful of participants, potentially limiting others' ability to discuss their concerns. There are two types of planning board meetings, regular and special. Both need to conform to open meeting laws. Regular meetings are held regularly. Montana statute requires regular meetings to be held 4 times per year on specific months. Your bylaws should specify those times, and you can add other times. Montana statute doesn't have specific noticing requirements for regular meetings, so be sure to include standards for noticing meetings in the bylaws. Montana statute allows special meetings to be called by the chair or at the request of any 2 board members. A minimum 2-day notice is required for special meetings, but can be waived if the special meeting is set at a regular meeting with all planning board members present. Before setting a special meeting without 2-day notice, the planning board should consider if the matters to be discussed are of public interest and necessitate a longer notice period. Whether it's a meeting or a hearing, the planning board cannot take official action without a quorum. The board must also comply with open meeting law requirements at the meeting, including opportunity for public comment and access to the materials in advance of the meeting. Official action should follow Robert's Rules of Order or a similar standard for procedure. Noticing requirements is one of the main features that distinguish hearings from meetings. Statute sets out noticing requirements for a variety of public hearings for numerous types of actions, including adopting regulations. For a hearing on a proposed subdivision, at least 15 days notice is required in a newspaper of general circulation. For a growth policy hearing, it's 10 days. Growth policy statute requires a community's growth policy to identify the process for a subdivision hearing. Typical hearing procedures are shown on the right column and include 1. Having a copy of the agenda available. 2. Having a sign-in sheet. This is for the meeting record. 3. Calling the meeting to order. The chair calls the meeting to order, takes roll call, introduces agenda and topics on the agenda, explains how the meeting will be conducted. 4. Staff presentation. Staff presents the review of the application and staff report. 5. Public comment. The planning board may start by requesting comment from the applicant and then comments from the public. Anyone who comments should state their name and address for the record. To reduce repetition in lengthy meetings, you can request that individuals limit their comments to 3 to 5 minutes and that others do not repeat what others have said, but merely indicate support for something already stated. When all have had a chance to speak, you can ask those who have already spoken if they have more to say. Number 6, close public testimony. Once all comment is completed, public testimony is closed. 7, board questions. At this point, the hearing is open for questions from the board to staff and the applicants or others. Number 8, deliberation and action. This is the point at which the planning board formulates the recommendations to the governing body. Use Robert's Rules of Order or similar for planning board members to introduce a motion, discuss, revise the motion if needed, and vote. Number 9, adjourn and set a date to continue. If a hearing is continued, the date and time should be announced to those in attendance and posted as soon as possible for those not in attendance. Bylaws typically include the following information. Number 1, authority, purpose, power, and duties. This section includes a citation to state statute regarding the legal authority for creating the planning board as well as its purpose, powers, and duties. Number 2, jurisdictional area. This section describes the jurisdictional area of the planning board. Remember, it can be any of the following: city, county, which is often a city with a ring of county area around it, or other combinations of cities and county. Number 5, members and terms. This describes the number of members, qualification, and length of terms. Bylaws should reflect or include state statutory requirements and can add other information such as absences, vacancies, and removal of a board member. Number 4, board officers, terms, and duties. Montana statute requires officer election at the first regular meeting of each year. This section also typically addresses roles of the president, vice president, officer vacancies, absences, removal of officers, and terms of office. Number 5, meetings, quorum, and procedures. This section provides detail for regular and special meetings, public hearings, what constitutes a quorum, noticing meetings, and procedures for board discussion and action, such as Robert's Rules of Order. Number 6, board member ethics and conduct. This section provides information on adhering to the principles of operating in the public interest and avoiding conflict of interest and ex parte communication. Number 7, committees. This section provides information on how committees might be established to advise the planning board. Number 8, administrative and legal. This section addresses board record keeping, including meeting records. This section also clarifies that boards will seek legal advice from the city or county attorney for the planning board jurisdiction that they're in. This section may also address financial issues such as reimbursement to planning board members for travel. Number 9, staff. This section discusses the role of staff. Functions typically include the role of the secretary, preparing staff reports on subdivisions or other applications, financial management, drafting an annual report and annual budget to be reviewed and approved by the planning board prior to submission to the governing body. Number 10, amendment and repeal of provisions. This section identifies procedures for amending bylaws and for repealing previous bylaws. Responsibilities of the planning board members include those of the president, vice president, secretary of staff, and all members of the planning board. Specifically, the president or chair presides over meetings, calls special meetings, signs official documents, represents the board in discussion with the governing body, and ensures board actions are properly taken. The vice president or vice chair performs duties of the president or chair when that individual is not present. The secretary is typically staff and keeps minutes, prepares meeting and or hearing notices and agendas, and keeps board records. All members should try and attend all the meetings. If you can't attend, let the secretary know. You should also be prepared for the meetings, be familiar with the bylaws, and be familiar with the growth policy and other regulations. And lastly, act ethically. A conflict of interest occurs when a board member could obtain some private benefit as the result of a planning board action. A private benefit may be either direct or indirect, such as creating a material personal gain or providing an advantage to relatives, neighbors, friends, or groups and associations to which the board members belong. Having a conflict of interest does not necessarily mean that you have done something wrong. It's normal to have a conflict arise from time to time. Not declaring a potential conflict of interest is wrong. It's illegal to fail to declare a substantial conflict of interest or to participate in discussion on issues or decisions where such conflict exists. Gifts, favors, or advantages should not be accepted if they are offered to influence the board member or if it could appear to the public that the gift was offered for that purpose. Even minor considerations that come in the form of business lunches or small gifts are not acceptable. The best guide for following regarding gifts and favors is this: if in doubt, decline the gift. Ex parte communication is a problem, although it may not involve any gifts or other private benefit for the planning board member. Ex parte is a Latin term that means from or on one side only. It is related to the public interest because it deals with the planning board's member being influenced from outside the public forum without the benefit of hearing all sides of an issue. Ex parte can include telephone calls, informal meetings, lunches, emails, or even casual encounter on a street corner. The essential element of an ex parte contact is that someone with a direct interest, an applicant, proponent, or an opponent to the project, is attempting to influence a planning board member. Here's how to deal with an ex parte contact. Stop the conversation when it veers to ex parte communication and invite the individual to present testimony before the entire planning board. If the person is unwilling to testify, encourage them to send a letter to planning staff so it's on the record. If you receive written information not sent to the planning board members, send it to planning staff to include in planning board packets. If you have ex parte contact, disclose the fact on the record before the meeting begins. We want to thank you for taking the time to listen to our presentation, and in closing, we will leave you with 10 best practices for all planning board members. 1. Prepare and maintain a growth policy. Refer to it, make decisions that are consistent with its policies, and implement them. 2. Develop and adopt bylaws and procedures and stick to them. 3. Annually re-examine what you are doing as a planning board member, how well you are doing it, and how to do it better. 4. Prepare an annual report that summarizes work of the past year and recommends priorities for the next year. Submit the report to the governing body and share it with the public. 5. Consider a public forum every year or so. Ask the public how things are going and what they want to be done. As a board, ask to participate in preparing the jurisdiction's planning budget. 7. Attend meetings with the governing body to exchange ideas and assess objectives. 8. As a board, communicate with staff what information you want that you may not be receiving and how you want materials presented. 9. Educate yourself. Attend courses on planning techniques or land use law. And lastly, advocate for good planning.